This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. I'm your host, Andrew Pledger, and I'm a survivor of Bob Jones University. BJU is a fundamentalist college with its roots in white supremacy and is known for its culture of indoctrination, conformity, and control. Its influence extends beyond its campus, impacting Christian schooling, politics, biblical counseling, and evangelical Christianity. The school serves as a hub for churches, schools, and camps, and these institutions perpetrate its abusive teachings and practices. This show explores these areas of influence and amplifies the stories of those who have been impacted by Bob Jones University. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello, everyone. This is your host, Andrew Pledger, and I am so excited for you to hear this two-part episode with Rich Merritt. And I want to tell you a little bit about him before we get into this episode. So, Rich is an author, attorney, and LGBTQ plus activist who has led a remarkable life. He was born in Greenville, South Carolina, to fundamentalist parents. He attended the Bob Jones schools from a young age all the way until the university, and he was at the university for 2 years and transferred to Clemson. He enlisted in the Marine Corps and served as a sergeant and an officer, while also appearing in adult films. He graduated from the University of Southern California Law School and served as a lawyer in California, Georgia, and New York. He wrote his memoir, Secrets of a Gay Marine Porn Star, in 2005. He has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, The Advocate, and Washington Post. And I am so excited for you to hear Rich's story and just know just how brave and strong of a person he is. And when the interview was over, I was so blown away by just his spiritual growth as a person and how just kind he is, and how he just even admitted to things he's still struggling with, but he's doing better. And I'm so happy that he was willing to do this interview. Now, let's get into this episode of Beyond BJU. For people listening, I am so excited, Rich, to have you on the show. And for those who aren't familiar, he wrote the memoir, Secrets of a Gay Marine Porn Star. I think I had heard about your memoir, I think earlier in the summer. I think it was when I started the Surviving BJU Facebook group that I think, or maybe it was Lance who told me about it. But anyways, I had heard about it and I was like, oh my gosh. And like, I wish I would have asked you to be on the Surviving BJU podcast, but I was so intimidated, honestly.
You did that was just like it should have been. That was a great series. It really reinvigorated me with hope for the space that you're providing for people to talk, to hear, to tell their stories. It's just a wonderful job you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. But yeah, so for people who aren't familiar with you, could you give a quick introduction?
Sure. My name is Rich Merritt. My pronouns are he, him. I'm presently an attorney in Georgia. I practice law at a nonprofit public interest law firm. We provide pro bono services to low-income clients. I was born in Greenville, but I grew up in nearby Piedmont. My family's lived in the Anderson County, Pickens County area of upstate South Carolina, going back all the way to the 1800s. It's more suburban now, but in the 70s and 80s, when I was growing up, it was very country, very rural. I attended Bob Jones for 14 years. I started at Bob Jones Elementary School from the first grade all the way to, it was back then it was divided into BJES, Bob Jones Junior High School, and then the academy. I graduated from the academy in 1985. I attended BJU for a semester, but when I turned 18 that semester, I joined the Marine Corps, and I stayed out for a semester to go to boot camp and then another school. And I returned to BJU and I finished another year, but midway through what would have been my sophomore year, I ended up transferring to Clemson. Officially, my transcript says that I withdrew while in a probationary status. But I could tell I was about to be expelled, so I just left. And I transferred to Clemson University, where I graduated undergrad, and then I went on to see the world, which, and quite literally I have. I want to stop here also. I want to say something else a little about myself. And actually, I want to say a couple things. The first thing is BJU. Okay. I've got friends who have only known me the last few years. They're going to be listening to this. They are queer like me. They're going to be thinking all kinds of tawdry and debaucherous things with the name BJU. It's something I've dealt with for decades, and I'm kind of tired of it. I know when we started BJ Unity, it was like, do we really want to name this that? But it was a perfect name, and we're not the ones, we didn't get to choose the name of this world's most unusual university. So yeah, if you're listening now and you think it's funny, get your giggles out, because Andrew and I are going to be saying BJU a lot. So anyway, yeah. The next thing is a little more seriously. I'm also a person in recovery from substance use disorder, and I've battled that for many years and struggled in and out of recovery, in and out of rehabs. So I've been sober 5 years this month. And what has made the difference this time has been certain principles. And one of those I was taught very early on is gratitude. Just begin with gratitude, end with gratitude, and throw a whole bunch of gratitude in the middle. So I am deeply and sincerely grateful to Bob Jones University. In my life today, I have friendships that I have had for over half a century, going back to kindergarten. One of my best friends, her name is Dawn. She flew into town a few weeks ago. We had a wonderful evening together. We went to an event together. And I have like 5 or 6 friends like that, people I can pick up the phone and call, that I met 40, 50 years ago at that school. I don't think I would have that if I hadn't started out there. And people in our culture today, especially men, don't have that. Like, that's one of the problems in our society, is that men do not live lives of vulnerability where they allow themselves to get that close to people. And I get the blessing of that. I don't even like to use that word all that much, but in this case, it fits. Now, that doesn't mean I excuse the harm and the damage that this place has caused, but the goal being equanimity, I can stand in the middle of that and I can see the good and the bad. And so I'm going to start with what the gratitude puts the place in perspective for me today. So that's where I like to begin.
Yeah, thank you so much for just sharing that. I think it is healthy trying to hold those two experiences. And that was something that was kind of hard for me as I made the Surviving BJU podcast, is like having those two experiences in my mind, but still pushing forward and trying to expose just all the harm that has happened. And thank you for your just vulnerability and just sharing your own experiences and giving that overview. And thank you also for addressing the BJU thing, because it gets on my every last nerve when I talk to people, and they're just like, BJU.
Yeah.
And like, I get it. It's funny to people who've never heard of it before. It's like,
I was giving an interview somewhere in the 20 years ago, and I said someone on the staff of BJU, and this guy, they just lost it. Like, you got to rethink this, what you're saying. And so when I would give interviews or speeches or something outside of Greenville, I would always say Bob Jones University. I never abbreviated it. And it gets it's so many words and so many syllables, but it's a small burden. But yeah, we're going to say BJU a lot, guys.
Yeah, we will. Yes, he will. So, wow. So I'm so excited to get to know you more, to dig into your story, and just for other people just to hear all the things that you went through. And I just recommend anyone, I'll link it in the bio. Please buy his memoir, Secrets of a Gay Marine Porn Star. I cannot recommend enough. Um, but yeah, so I'm really just excited to interview you and really have this podcast to really get to know other people who are also raised in fundamentalism. But yeah, so you were raised in fundamentalism since you were born. Oh, sorry. One more thing I want to get into. Sorry. So one thing that people were annoyed with the Surviving BJU is I sometimes forgot to ask people what years they went to Bob Jones. So could you give people the actual years that you went through, like all their school systems, and by the time you were expelled, or sorry, withdrew?
Yeah. So I started first grade in 73 and I graduated the academy in 1985. And then I went to the university and then the day that I left was October 12th, 1987. Yeah. Those are my years.
You were raised in fundamentalist Christianity, and in your memoir, you say that my life on the outside seemed very simple. It revolved around my immediate family and religion. So, from the outside, it might have looked simple, but really, can you tell me your earliest memories about growing up in this kind of environment? Like, what were the feelings, what were the expectations, and really, what was just the impact from the church you grew up in?
The first church that my family attended was a Pentecostal holiness church in Powdersville, South Carolina. It was actually named McNeely Memorial back then. I think it's changed names. That was actually a family name. I think my paternal great grandmother um, was a McNeely. So we actually went to a church that was literally named after an ancestor. I still have some home movies from that time. I recently digitized them. My aunt died earlier this year, and so I was putting them back together for my family. And there's Easter Sunday, 1968 or 1969. I mean, that's how old these are. I still have that image of people coming out of the church and my dad standing there with one of those 8mm movie cameras, and people are coming out and they're dressed in their absolute finest. I mean, the women are wearing hats and gloves. The men are all in suits. And, we were country. I mean, really country. And they looked fantastic. Like it was a Norman Rockwell painting for anyone who still knows what Norman Rockwell paintings are. That's how it looked on the outside. And my earliest memories of my early childhood memories are wonderful. Out in the summer, grandparents' house in the backyard, catching lightning bugs, eating watermelon, making homemade ice cream with the cousins and the aunts and uncles. That's my memory of those early years. But what was really going on, and I wouldn't find this out until later, we quit going to that church. And at the time, it was because my dad actually started going. When I started first grade, my dad started, he was a freshman at Bob Jones University. He went back to school. But we left the Pentecostal church at that point in time because it was too charismatic. And then we started going to Southside Baptist Church when it was in Greenville on Augusta Road, the old building that's been torn down. But it was like 3,000 members back then, which was huge. It was quite a change. A big part of the reason why we left was this preacher was having affairs with more than one woman in our community, and it ripped our community apart. So I didn't find that out till I was 13 or 14. And so it goes back and it stains my early memory with this perfect image of what it was like with this kind of the sexual scandal. And no one ever talked about it after it happened and just kind of swept it under the rug. So that was really impactful about how that's the way you deal with such things. Things that, you asked about, I think, expectations. I mean, there were a lot of rules, but, as a child that worked for me. I liked having structure. I was a very shy child. I preferred to be alone, reading a book, playing the piano, listening to my show tunes on the turntable. That was how I spent my 8, 9, 10-year-old years. I was very happy that way, and that worked for me. It didn't really, the kind of picture perfect image was shattered when I was 9 years old. I was in the fourth grade at Bob Jones Elementary, and my mother had, well, it wasn't really a miscarriage, it was a stillbirth. She carried a baby full term. And back then, you didn't know the gender. A fetus was not assigned a gender. I mean, I'll call it a child because my parents and we had chose to have it. We were looking forward to it very much. And she was a girl, and we had wanted a girl, a baby sister. That devastated us because people didn't talk about things in 1976, didn't talk about things like that. And there was a lot of, I remember feeling the blame and the shame. Like, what did you do wrong? And my mom just struggling to sort through with what she had done wrong. And things were never really the same after that. My dad actually, he quit going to church for a while because he was so upset. And my mom would take my brother and me to church. And then, then there were just Sundays we wouldn't go. Years later, when I was on my way out of BJU, and the assistant dean of men actually looked at me and said, "Are you bitter because your parents aren't right with God? Because we know that they haven't gone to church." I mean, I've worked through that, and I'm over it for years now. I've been over it, but I offer that here. That's evidence of the sickness and delusion of that place. No administrator at any educational or so-called educational institution should be saying something like that to a young person under their care. But as your own podcast has shown, they're still saying that stuff. So yeah, we're going to keep talking about it and talking about what this should not be happening and it needs to stop.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I'm so sorry that your family went through that. And it is so difficult in these fundamentalist environments because it's kind of assumed that if you're following the formula, everything will work out. And it's really sad that when bad things like this happen, that their assumption is, what did I do wrong? There's kind of like this assumption, like, is God punishing me in a sense? And was that kind of the feeling around that of like when that happened was, did we disobey God? Did we sin? Or what were the reasonings for that self-blame?
I I think so. I remember struggling myself trying to come up with an understanding of why it had happened. I mean, I'm 9 years old, and I had heard about a family that had had several miscarriages, and we were in the car, and I said, "Well, then it's not so bad for us." My dad was a very kind man. He's been deceased for many years now, but he snapped at me and said, "No, what happened to us was terrible." And that was it. And I started crying, but it was never addressed again. My mom was sitting at the table crying one day, and I came in and I said, "Don't worry, Mama. Elizabeth that was her name. We had named her. Her name's on the tombstone. I can visit the grave." And I said, "Elizabeth's in a better place now." And my mom just through her tears, she said, "What if all my children were in a better place? Where would that leave me?" And I mean, we needed family therapy, and there was no such thing at that time. You didn't need family therapy. You just needed to pray and go to church and talk to the preacher. And if that, but
Hmm.
it devastated us.
Yeah.
We weren't the
Wow.
same.
And people in your church had to know. How did they react to that?
We had been going to Southside, and it's one of those things when I hear about the mega churches now. I can't remember which writer it is. It might be Anne Lamott. One of these, I love Anne Lamott. She's very spiritual. I met her a few years ago. But I don't know if it's her. Someone says when you move to a new town, find the smallest church in your neighborhood and go to that church. And if you don't like that one, go to the next smallest. But people gravitate to these mega churches. And we were going to Southside, which had 3,000 members. We didn't know anyone. No one knew us. No one reached out. No one offered any assistance to us that I recall. We had family. My mom has sisters and brothers and sisters-in-law, but other than that, I don't remember any support.
Yeah. Wow. Now it must be so hard to have been in that environment, but like realize that no, like you didn't have that closeness, that connection. And then, on top of that, years later, for you to be, sitting in the office of under a Bob Jones administrator or leader, and them just just bringing up your parents.
I doubt he knew the connection
Uh-huh.
to the reason my dad had not gone to church was because he was angry with God. Now he started going back to church after that, but he he went through a few years there when he was angry and upset and bitter for his own reasons. And that you don't know what you don't know, so shut up, just be quiet about it. You're
Yeah.
supposed to be a
Like,
counselor type person and you don't know what you're talking about, so just don't
yeah.
say anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, oh, it's been eye-opening to me as I've interviewed different survivors from Bob Jones and just hear the ways that these really people that are in positions of power treat people who are under them. Is very condescending. They're very authoritarian, very like really shaming, and just using that to emotionally, verbally, just psychologically abuse those who are under them. And is just hearing stories of people just being blamed and shamed. I'm just like, where are they following Jesus in any of that, where he says, weep with those who weep. When I read the Grace Report and just hear all the horrible things that survivors were treated, and just didn't see, they claim to be an institution that follows Christ.
Well,
Um,
blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed
mhm.
are the meek, for they
Yeah.
will inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Yeah, there's none of that there.
Yes, it's very much, they're so focused on the outward appearance. I think from what I experience, or how it looks to everyone else, they care so much about the reputation, but they don't really care about what's actually going on, how people are actually feeling. Authoritarian institutions don't care about that. They just want you to stay in line and do what they say. They don't really care about what you're experiencing or what core issues are really there. But something that I'm really curious about is you got into the Bob Jones world from an early age, like you said first grade.
So my first time at BJU, I was on the campus. I was 5 years old. It was the summer of '73. I had gone to Tabernacle Baptist Kindergarten. Is Tabernacle still around? Like, do people still know what that is?
Okay, so is this the church that was like founded by Harold B. Sightler?
Seidler. Yeah, it was Dr.
Oh my
Seidler's
gosh.
church.
Okay,
Yeah.
the church I attended in childhood, the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, we had a room named after him. The church I grew up in was Gospel Light Baptist Church in Walkertown, North Carolina. It was pastored by Brother Bobby Robertson, and I think they were friends, I think, and close and knew each other. So he named a room after him. I remember it throughout my childhood because it was a room that was used for children's choirs practice and children's church. Wow, that's bringing me back. And I remember them saying, "All right, we're having choir practice in the Harold B. Sightler room at this time." And I never knew who he was growing up. And I didn't find out who he was until I got to Bob Jones University and I started researching churches. And I did actually visit Tabernacle once. And like I think
You're kidding.
they have an
Wow.
orphanage, don't they?
Yeah.
Or an orphanage, a college, and then it's a church,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like a Dickensian, I want more, sir, more, please. That type of, something from a horrible Charles Dickens novel. Yeah. My teacher at Tabernacle, she was the worst. She was horrible. I mean, she just would come in and paddle everyone for no reason. That might be why, I didn't really remember why my parents transferred me to Bob Jones. And I think that was why, because she was just such a terrible teacher. And I went to Tabernacle with two other people when I mentioned the friends I still have now. One of them is named Melissa. She went to Tabernacle to be transferred to Bob Jones. She was my girlfriend in junior high. Okay, funny story. After my memoir came out, she reached out to me. She's now a lesbian R&B singer. She came to Greenwich Village in Manhattan when I lived there, and she performed at this club called The Bitter End. The Bitter End is where Bob Dylan has performed, Stevie Wonder, Lady Gaga. I mean, it's a tiny venue, but it's very special, and it's on Bleecker Street. And so Melissa's there, and it was like a little Bob Jones reunion. I think Dawn came up, and the late Dr. Bierman's son was there. There were a few others, and it was just this wonderful experience. And the manager of that club said that listening to Melissa Reeves perform was the second greatest out-of-body experience he had ever had. I didn't ask him what the first was because I kind of want to leave that as a mystery. But like, that's what I mean when, I have to be grateful to this place because this is this incredible experience. But Melissa, Dawn, and I transferred to Bob Jones Elementary. And I don't think Melissa was there, but Dawn and I had to take this entrance examination. And that's when I met her. And so I was 5. I think she was 6 because she's a little older, maybe like 2 months older. But we took this test, right? And we had just taken this test at the end of kindergarten. And I thought, well, I just took this test. This is a waste of my time. I'm 5. I got places to be. I answered all the questions. Well, the teacher was typical of Bob Jones. She was such a sweet, kind, just wonderful human being. I'm sure she's probably deceased by now because she was a little older even then. Her name was Harriet Boggs, and Miss Boggs came over to me and she said, "Young man, we're only at question 5 and you've answered all the questions. You're all the way at question 10 or 15 or whatever." I was petrified. Like I'm such a people pleaser, and to think that this woman is now I've just met is not happy with me. I couldn't even speak. Well, Dawn, who was sitting catty corner to me, she threw her pencil down and said, "We just took this test and we already know all the answers." And that kind of set the stage for our next 50 years. But that was my entrance to Bob Jones Elementary School. We started first grade, that August. So you got to remember, I lived 15 miles from campus. So my mom was driving me 15 miles every day. She actually got a job next to the campus just to make it convenient. That's how committed my parents were to sending me to this school that, the dean would later say, "Are you bitter because they're not right with God?" But our lives focused around this institution. Back then, the elementary school was on campus. It was where the women's dormitories are. I think it later became the speech building, but that was, I liked Bob Jones Elementary School. My teachers were all very kind women with maybe an exception or two. One of them who I actually liked and kept up with for years, she made me play soccer. I didn't like that. I didn't want to be on the field. I didn't want to play sports. I was very happy just reading books, but by and large, it was a very good experience.
And like, what were some really core experiences that stood out to you during your time there?
I remember the catechism, and we had these catechism contests. Who made you? God made me. What else did God make? God made all things. Why did God make you in all things? So I remember being in a catechism contest, and that might be my first memory of Bob Jones III. I was in school with Bobby Jones IV. I don't remember him in first grade though, but I know we were in the same second grade classroom. My first memory of, it's weird because, from reading my book, we're full disclosure, he's one of my dear friends today.
Yeah.
Back then, we called him Bobby, and our teacher had put up these pictures of all the presidents in the back of the classroom. And I was standing there studying the presidents, and Bobby was standing beside me, and we were kind of like, I guess we had a test or something. We had to memorize them. But you have to remember, this is August of 1974 or September of 1974. And what had happened the month before was that Richard Nixon had resigned the presidency. So there's this picture of Richard Nixon, and then the teacher had just taped up a sheet of paper with the name President Gerald Ford on it. And it was really kind of weird looking. We didn't even have his picture yet because it was all so sudden, like it was the scandal. And I was like, I didn't know that. Like, I remember Richard Nixon resigning and seeing it on the TV and that ridiculous salute that he gave when he got on the helicopter, but he was the only president I had ever known. So I couldn't conceive of him not being the president. And so I said to Bobby, well, who's Ford? Nixon's the president. And Bobby said, Nixon lied. He can't be the president anymore. And that was our first conversation. Now, you might think this is not a normal conversation that, 7-year-olds have, but that was kind of par for the course for us. I didn't realize who he was right then. I went home and told my parents that, there was this kid in my class named Bobby Jones. And my dad, because I think he was still in school, he said, oh, I had heard that Dr. Bob III's son was in the elementary school. I didn't realize he was in your class. So for people who are not familiar with the Bob Jones world, it might be impossible to conceive of what that moment was like. But this is a little fiefdom, and it's the only world that I know. So making this discovery was like realizing, oh, this kid I've been talking to is like the Prince of Wales. And I'm this pauper coming in from the country. That's how I went into school every day. And most of my classmates, their parents were administrators or faculty members or staff members. And they had their own hierarchy. Like Bob Taylor's son was in my class. He's like the Duke of Suffolk or something. The way it was structured back then, it was like that, at least how I felt. I've always been a bit of a drama queen, I guess. So I came to school every day kind of with this sense of, oh, I don't really fit in here because I'm from the next county over. My family, though, started to view me, my cousins and aunts and uncles, like, oh, your parents are sending you to this private school in town. So I started getting this real sense of isolation, unworthiness at school, isolation from my family. That was a pretty powerful, impact on me. Bobby and I both got decent grades, although I think at that point we became more like, I guess the word today would be frenemies, because we were so competitive. As we grew up, like Dawn was also one of those. The teachers there did, especially our 5th grade teacher, kind of fostered a very competitive environment where we were pitted against each other a lot, but maybe in the good, in the end, it was good for us. I don't know. As far as our friendship in high school, we were working together on a play, the junior senior play. And that's when we were starting to get to know each other better. But then midway through our 11th grade year, he got expelled. That was a whole palace coup situation. It was over Christmas. Bob III and Benneth were out of town. And I won't go into the details of the incident. You can buy my book and read it if you want to. But one of the administrators, I guess, who had been left in charge, took it upon himself to expel Bobby. And, it's one of those, I guess it put Bob III in an awkward position because he couldn't really undo this decision because it would definitely look like nepotism or favoritism. That was my early relationship with Bobby.
Yeah, thank you so much just for sharing that, because that was something that really stood out to me in the book. Was I didn't realize before that you are still friends with Bob Jones IV, and I think, what do you refer to him now? Is it Rob? I think now
he goes by Rob, and that's how I know him now. Our friendship is, he came back to the school about the same time I left, and so for about 10 years I didn't have any contact with him. In fact, the only contact it wasn't direct contact, but I was in the Marines. I was out in the Mojave Desert on some training. And I asked one of the Marines when he was coming back from the main part of the base, to bring me a newspaper. And he brought the LA Times. And I'm reading the LA Times, and there's an op-ed by Bob Jones IV. And I'm like, I cannot get away from this. It was just ridiculous. We kind of laugh about it now, but there was a TV show that was really popular called LA Law. And one of the characters on this show, they were trying to even out the cast or something. And she was a lawyer who had graduated from Bob Jones University. And, Bob Jones IV wrote this op-ed addressing that. And I'm like, I cannot get away from this place, I cannot or this guy. That was the only contact we had. That was the only memory I have of him during those years. And, he was being groomed to be the president of Bob Jones University. So at that point, I didn't want anything to do with any of it. I had run literally around the world as far as Okinawa, Japan, even to try to get away from not really to try to get away from this place. I wanted to see the world, but I didn't have to think about it, except I had a battalion commander over there whose daughter went to Bob Jones University. I mean, that's how crazy it was. The school just kept popping up. But other than that, I wouldn't really think about it. But then in 97, he chose to leave. And I found out about it. I think Dawn ran into Bob the third and Bennett at the airport in Greenville. And that's how she found out. And she told me, and then she got his contact information and passed it to me. And our friendship grew from then. And he's chosen to live a very private, anonymous life. And as his friend, someone who's been with me through some very difficult times, I respect that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing what you felt you could about him. And yeah, that was why I did not mention him in the Surviving BJU podcast, was because when I did research, it was very obvious to me that he did want to keep a very private life. So that's why I left him out. But when I read your book, I was like, oh, well, he talks about him publicly in this. So I'm like, let's dig a little bit into that, because it is something that had always kind of like been so curious to me. And I remember even hearing rumors just about different things about Bob Jones the Fourth. He was basically just seen as the black sheep of the Jones family.
He loves his family very much. You know, we've had a few, I wouldn't say heated discussions. He said that he wishes the rest of the world could see his family the way he does. And of course, I say, I wish you could see your family the way I do. You know, that's just kind of the standoff. And I had many years when I didn't want to think about Bob Jones. But then when I did, I went into therapy, and then I wrote my book. And I know you might want to talk more. You mentioned you might want to talk more about that later, but in doing the work for my book, that was the thing. When it came out, I received so many responses from people everywhere I went. I can still remember the face of a man in Boston when I did a book reading at Calamus bookstore there. He came to my book reading in 2005. He had long hair, and he just had this drawn look of just depression, decades of depression. And he said to me, I graduated from Bob Jones University in 1964, and it ruined my life. And that's just the penultimate example, but I had so many examples of that. And I remember, well, my first memory of Bob III was actually on the TV show, Show My People, that the university had, named after that verse in Isaiah, I think, show my people their transgressions. And it was during that period, for some reason, I wasn't at church, and it was on Sunday morning. And it was in 1979, around that time period, when there was a very anti-gay backlash that was happening in the post-Stonewall years. And it was led by this woman named Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant was like the Marjorie Taylor Greene of her day. Just awful, awful person. I think she's still alive. I don't know. But Bob III, of course, was a big fan of Anita Bryant. And he was preaching this sermon against homosexuality on Show My People, the TV show, Bob Jones's TV show. I didn't know what homosexuality was. So I went and asked my mom, and she just like, go talk to your dad. And my dad didn't even want to talk about it either. And I had but my first memory of hearing about homosexuality was from Bob Jones III. And then a few years later, I figured out what it was and, what homosexuality is. And then the AIDS crisis began. And my first memory of hearing about AIDS was from Bob Jones Jr. preaching in chapel from that chapel platform. There's this new cancer that only the sodomites can get. And I thought he's crazy. Yeah. But it turned out he sounded like he might be right. That was my first memory of that. I have another vivid memory of Bob III standing up in that chapel platform. There had been an artist series the night before when a conductor or a director of some kind had been there. And I guess he was very effeminate. The conductor was. And Bob III stood up the next day from that chapel platform, making fun of him, using an effeminate voice and effeminate tone. As it turns out, I heard that the artist series person was there. Like he was witnessed
Oh
this
no.
this narcissist making fun of him like that. I also remember in 1984, the Democrats had their convention in San Francisco. That was a big deal because San Francisco had a woman mayor, Dianne Feinstein. And he made a big deal about that. Like when the men, like the homosexuals, refuse to be leaders and the women have to step up and take positions of authority. We heard stuff like that all the time. He gave a quote to the AP in 1980. Now, I uncovered that when I was researching my memoir. I don't remember it happening in 1980, but he said that homosexuals should be stoned to death, like the Bible commands.
And didn't he say this at the White House?
He was at the White House. There was the post-Stonewall years. There was a big movement to add LGBT, well, probably not T then, but, LGB issues to the Civil Rights Act, to one of the titles under the Civil Rights Act. And of course, all these ministers went to the White House, taking all these signatures on petitions, opposing that. Jimmy Carter was still the president. And, Jimmy Carter, he's come out as very pro LGBTQ rights, but he was back then, even the Democrats weren't completely on board. And so that's why they were there. And while he was one of the ministers at the White House, he gave this statement to an AP reporter. I uncovered that for my book on LexisNexis, and it had the full quote. I'm a lawyer by background, so I want to triple check my data, my evidence that I'm going to present. I found the Washington Post and the New York Times had quoted Bob III, but they left out the part about homosexuals being stoned to death. I don't know why. It was only on the AP that had it. So I put that in my book. But I don't remember that a specific comment in 1980. I mean, I would have only been 13. But we heard stuff like that all the time. I mean, that's evidence of the leader of our cult. So that's going to trickle down through the teaching. So getting back to what we were talking about, by the time I did this work and found that quote and did all the other quotes, I had reached a point where, Bob IV, Rob, is a wonderful human being. He's one of my dear friends, and I love him. I hated Bob Jones III, hated the man. I grew to this intense hatred of him. And it was really eating at my soul, like how to deal with that. I was in therapy at the time, and I had to reach a moment where I had to ask myself, which is greater? My love for the son or my hatred for the father. Is love going to be greater or is hatred? And I have to come down on the side of love. It took me years to get there. But if hatred is greater than love, I mean, that's what the fundamentalists believe. There's this God who's going to send billions of souls to hell for eternity. That's hatred, right? There's no other word for it. I have to believe that love is greater than hatred. And otherwise, let's just end it now. So if I believe that love is greater than hatred, then what does that mean for me? I have to stop hating the father. And I can honestly say I don't hate him anymore. I don't love him yet. I can't really say that.
That's
Now,
understandable.
I loved Bennett. Bennett Jones, she was elegant. She was grace. She could accessorize. I mean, she was as charming as she could be. Now, I know some of the women who you've talked to feel very differently about her, but she was my friend's mom, right? So, but yeah, it took me a long time to get to a place where if I'm going to love, then it has to be pure. And so now I still hate Donald Trump, and I think that's okay for now. I know where my work is, but I have to remember that going forward. And I have to remember that my friend loves his family. He loves his father. So that has caused me to temper some of the things that I've done over the years. Some people may have felt like I've pulled my punches. Some people have felt like I've wasted opportunities, but I'm happy, or I'm content with the decisions that I've made about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you're at peace with that, and just that you've been able to deal with that in therapy and process it, because in fundamentalism, when you experience any of those kinds of feelings towards other people, you're just supposed to feel so bad just for even feeling that. You're so sinful for even experiencing that. You're not allowed to feel that. You're so depraved, instead of opening up a place of like compassion and curiosity and trying to understand really like the root. And it's just as I really learn more about like Bob Jones's view of human nature and just mental health, it's like that is very typical fundamentalist black and white view of like this is the root. And my research, what I saw a lot was the heart issue. That's what they like to use a lot. They have a very specific or narrow view of what that is, like the heart issue. And it's just they try to simplify things that are so complex. And when you get to the point where you have to force people like, oh, this is where you have to end up, this is the conclusion you have to come to, this, we know, we have the answer, we know what's going on inside of you, that person can never truly get to the point where they really understand the complexity of what is going on. So I'm curious, what did you discover, if you're comfortable sharing, like as you dug into therapy with that hatred for him, what were the complex, hard things that were going on inside of you?
Well, I had to go back to the beginning and look at, there was a point in human evolution when we reached the first person realized, oh my God, I'm going to die. And from that moment on, wherever many thousands of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago that was, humans did something. We created systems of immortality to give us everlasting life. And no one knows what happens when we die. No one who has ever lived has ever known what's going to happen when we die. And the key to life is to become okay with that uncertainty. But somebody like fundamentalists can't live with that uncertainty. They have to have the certainty. And that's a delusion. It was actually a Bob Jones grad who told me about this book. I have it. I know I have it here somewhere. Oh yeah, here it is. It's called Denial of Death. Yeah, Amy. So one of my first influences, around 2000, a woman named Amy who had graduated from Bob Jones in the 80s published an article in Esquire magazine. And it was called Me and Mr. Jones or something. And I reached out to her because she was definitely not in that space anymore. And it was the first time I had seen anyone publish anything, anyone from Bob Jones who published anything anti-Bob Jones. And she and I kept in touch for a few years. I really liked her. But she told me about that book. And that's what that book says. So much of what we do now is about our inability to cope with the fact that we're going to die. Like, that's just where it goes. So people who can't live with the uncertainty of that, they are the people who are least capable of living with that uncertainty. They flock to something like fundamentalism and they stick with it. I mean, we were born into it, but you and I and many others, we reach a point where we realize, well, it has so many flaws toward the end, like many that you've discovered in your podcast, that there's something that goes wrong with it from the beginning. And it's that delusion. And if you're going to believe that, if you're going to insist, if you're going to confuse belief and knowledge and say, well, I know what's going to happen, then you're going to make all kinds of, if you get anything right after that, it's going to be by accident. And that's where, someone like Bob III, he was born into this position in life that he was not qualified for. Under his management, the university is greatly diminished. It used to be a big deal. I mean, before there was Jerry Falwell, before there was Pat Robertson, it was Bob Jones University. I mean, Billy Graham went there. That's how big a deal Bob Jones University used to be. And under his management, it's not even half of what it used to be. And so I had to look at that like, I don't know what other choices he could have made to make the decision that his son made takes courage to walk away from that much privilege, that much entitlement, to have this little mini fiefdom empire at your beck and call, to be able to stand in that huge platform in the amphitheater every day and to have those minds that you can just spout off nonsense off the top of your head, and they've got to listen to you, or they get demerits, or they at least have to be there. They don't have to necessarily listen to you. I mean, who walks away from that? And he didn't. He followed that path. And the hatred that I used to feel is now, it's actually, you mentioned it, compassion. Compassion is the key. But I also feel sorry for him. I mean, I know his son better than he does because of his delusional narcissism. He will never get to know what a truly wonderful, amazing person his own son is.
Mm,
I get to know that. I get
yeah.
that blessing and I get that gift.
Mm, wow. Yeah, that is just so sad. And I think also, wow, it just communicates how like fundamentalism again separates people.
That's something you've brought out so well, and I hadn't even thought about. It separates us even from ourselves. To me, the idea of sin is separation. In addiction recovery, we were taught that the opposite of addiction is connection. And if I'm going to heal from that, I have to reach out. I have to find open community. I have to be able to be vulnerable with a group of people. I have to ask for help. And then you've got this cult that its defining characteristic is separation. That's hell. That's hell on earth. That form of separation, any form of separation like that.
Hmm. It was eye-opening to me as I learned about all the levels of like separation, like you said, yes, from yourself, from even like the other people around you, and then of course like separation just completely just from the outside world. And yeah, it is hell. And I remember I related so much on the when I think yeah, Michaela Halliwell on the Surviving BJU podcast, she just explicitly said, fundamentalism, like that was my hell. Bob Jones University, that was my hell.
There's in Sanskrit, the word, I believe it's in Sanskrit, is Maya. Maya is the illusion of separation. That when we're born into this existence, we take on the Maya that I I can't, I'm separated from God. I'm separated from the divine. I'm separated from you. We're separated from each other. And that's an illusion. And as I grow spiritually, I understand that more and more. True spirituality is the divine in me connecting to the divine in you, so that then we can then connect to the divine that is in everyone and that is out there. That's what it means to grow spiritually. Now, going back to something you asked me earlier, what does it mean to let go of the hatred? Then I have to understand, I got to connect to the divine in Bob the Third. Oh my
Not
God,
easy. Oof, that's difficult.
that's my work, right? And so I don't know. Like I have a spiritual teacher that I go to occasionally, not nearly enough. She's a Swami monk, and she offers guidance on that. Like you get quiet, you get still, you quiet your thoughts. And I did a lot of meditation during the pandemic, like up to an hour a day. I don't do that much now, but every other day, at least I make a point to do some meditation. But that's where we get to it. At first I thought meditation would be, I'm going to be all alone, but the more I do it, the more I realize that's where the universe is. That's how you connect. You get to people, and then I can go about my life and I can have compassion. And that's where you said compassion, and that's where it begins.
Yes, yes, I agree 100%. And something I wanted to kind of move on to is in your memoir, I related to like so many things like in your childhood, the feelings, the emotions, like the family dynamics. But like there were, as I was reading it, I really noticed like these three core things through it, which is so common in fundamentalism, is like the shame, the loneliness, and of course, like the perfectionism, which I've learned is a mask for shame. Perfectionism is all it's about what will other people think. So you have to put on this outward appearance of things because of that shame. But I think also like on a deeper level from a queer experience, I think it really communicated just how just different you feel, like you don't fit in. And like I related so much to some of the behavior in your childhood of just being alone, being shy. That was me, being like really enmeshed or codependent with your mother, and then the father is like really cold. I was like, it hit me really hard reading it. Like I had to take breaks. It's like I'm like, this is just too familiar with these different dynamics. But how did you navigate the shame, the perfectionism, the loneliness through that?
I don't know. I would say that I navigated it, at least not in the beginning. So, when I was younger, like I said, I was very happy to be sitting alone, reading a book, playing the piano. But of course, as you get more into junior high school years, it becomes obvious that I'm with other kids and I'm not one of them. And so I started adopting and mimicking and learning the things that the guys would say to each other to try to fit in. And I wouldn't say I became popular, but I did become, like, I was elected president of my society in the academy. I was elected president of the Inter-Society Council. I dealt with all and you nailed it, loneliness, shame, and perfectionism. I dealt with that by just becoming a very goal-driven kid. If I could just get the next A, if I could get the next office, if I could get the part in the next play, if I could win the next debate or the next drama competition, forensics competition, that was my thing. And at the graduation from the academy, the award that I got was the activities award. I just kept myself busy, and that became my pattern up until I was about 30 when it all crashed. But yeah, in the early years, it was just pursue the next goal, win it. You might lose it, but then you get back up, you pursue the next goal, and everything will be fine.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it was just, again, like that perfectionism of just really what I saw throughout it was I have to play this role to be loved and accepted. I can never be truly loved and accepted. Like you can never be loved and accepted for who you were. That's what really I got.
The next thing I'm going to win, maybe that'll give me the level of love I need. I'm also describing, a precursor to addiction. My
Yeah.
first drug of choice, codependency was my first problem. I was so codependent, being controlled or controlling others, and it was my Christian school teachers. It was Jesus. It was, if I could just get them to be happy with me and love me, then I'll be okay.
Yeah. And I think really what I really thought about in my experiences too, and I was reading it, is just like you're trying to be the perfect person to play this role. And it's like then, you discover your sexuality and it just like destroys all of that in your mind because in that world, that's like the one of the worst things. And so I'm curious for you, you're this kid growing up trying to play the part, be perfect, do all the things, getting all these awards, and then, grappling with your sexuality. Like, and I know you didn't have the language for that really back then to understand, I think, to the full extent. Like from what you said, sodomite is what you heard, and you heard about homosexuality. But like looking back, like what were some like signs or awareness of your sexuality growing up and being gay in that environment?
My first memory was in the 6th grade. We had to take swimming lessons, and it was at the swimming pool, the big gym there in the middle of campus behind the Rodehaver. And there was a swimming pool in the back. And so we took swimming lessons, and I was 12 years old, I guess. And the coach had brought in 2 or 3 men from the university who were good swimmers to help make sure we didn't drown. And after one of our swimming lessons, I was showered and getting changed. And I'm sitting at the locker room, and I look up, and standing right next to me is this 19, 20-year-old man with I can't even describe the feeling of just overwhelming desire, attraction, just wanting to have it, to consume it. He was naked. He was beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed, muscular. I could not take my eyes off of him. I had no idea what was happening in me, what I was feeling, what I was thinking. And then he looked down at me and realized I was staring at his, those body parts. And from his perspective, he's a 20-year-old with a 12-year-old kid staring at his junk. So of course he's uncomfortable. Like I can totally get what he's thinking, but he's like, "What are you looking at?" And I immediately looked away. And so right away, my first image of that desire and sex and wanting that, um, was immediately pegged with shame. This is forbidden. This should not be happening. And going away from that constantly with that inner turmoil and churning of emotions, that was my first memory of it.
Yes, and I know in your book too, you talk about you worked at the Wilds, the Christian camp that Bob Jones is just known for being affiliated with. And so could you talk about what years did you work at the camp and what experience you have with your sexuality there also?
The first time I went to the camp was between the 6th and 7th grades. I was a camper. That was like 79. And I worked there like 80. I think I went to the CIT camp. They had a counselor, camper in training. And then 84 was when I worked there. And so I worked there the summers of 84, 85, 86. I was a dishwasher, landscaping, that sort of thing. It's summer, it's in the mountains, it's hot. If you're familiar with the Wilds, there's this creek that runs all around the camp, but it goes into the woods, and there's a series of waterfalls. There's the first falls, the second falls, the third falls. And by the time you get to the fourth falls, it's a huge waterfall. It's one of the highest waterfalls in North Carolina. It's absolutely beautiful. And that's where they would always take campers. Well, nobody ever really went to the third falls. And one of the things that I've learned that other deeply closeted gay men would do is we would get our friends to go to the third falls with us, and we would just end up going skinny dipping. And that was one of the first things that I remember, the homoeroticism of the Wilds. One time there was another staff member. When it would rain, after a rain, the creek would really rise. I mean, it would be like Whitewater Rapids. We probably shouldn't have been on it. In fact, this time we shouldn't have been, but this guy, I remember his real name. I'm not going to use it here, but we went inner tubing together, and it got to be so treacherous that we fell off the inner tubes. The inner tubes went soaring down the river, and we were just laughing, and we got out of the river, but our clothes were so soaked, and he was a little bit older, and he said, we should just take our clothes off. And I was like, okay. So we did, and we got buck naked, and nothing sexual happened other than a lot of staring and walking through the woods as our clothes were allegedly drying, I guess. If something had happened, I don't know how the rest of my life would have gone, because I'm such an addict that once I give in to a desire like that, I want as much as I can have all the time. And that didn't happen, but I still remember that vividly. It was really, really hot, actually.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. This was part 1 of Secrets of a Gay Marine Porn Star with Rich Merritt. In part 2, you will hear the rest of his story. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.